Vamos a continuar con las últimas conferencias magistrales. Gracias. La primera conferencia magistral está a cargo del doctor Kevin Whelan. Nos hablará de alimentos ultraprocesados y aditivos alimentarios en salud y las enfermedades intestinales. El doctor es catedrático de dietética en el Clinical College de Londres. Dirige un programa de investigación que explora la interacción entre la dieta y la microbiota intestinal, incluyendo probióticos, perbióticos, dietas bajas en FODMAPs, aditivos alimentarios y ultraprocesados, por lo cual ha escrito múltiples artículos. Adelante, doctor. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank you very much to everybody for staying right until the end of today's session to hear about what I'm talking about today, which is ultra-processed foods and food additives in gut health and disease. My name is Kevin Whelan, I'm a dietitian, and I'm excited to be able to talk about this exciting topic. I will start by apologizing. The entire lecture is going to be in English because my Spanish is very, very small, so it will be a very short lecture otherwise. Here are my conflicts of interest, none of which have impacted on what I will include in my presentation today. Go to your supermarket, and this is what you see when you're walking around looking at the shelves. Here are nationally representative data about the intakes of ultra-processed foods. You can see the United States and the United Kingdom are leading the world in eating ultra-processed foods. In the US and the UK, we eat more than 50% of our foods consumed are ultra-processed foods. I've highlighted here data for nationally representative food intake data in Mexico, where 23% of energy, of every calorie consumed, about a quarter of the calories consumed in Mexico are ultra-processed foods. And I'm going to talk in the next 20 minutes about the impact of this and of food additives on gut health and gut disease. This is the result of an umbrella review of all of the systematic reviews and meta-analyses, including 9 million people, of the association between ultra-processed food intake and disease. I am 100% certain that people who eat more ultra-processed foods have greater risk of disease. And what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is have a critical look at whether that may be cause or consequence or just a coincidence, because most of the data that we get from these studies are observational in nature. And I will end by talking about some of the intervention studies that we've done on this particular topic. So I want to be really critical of the data. I'm going to start here. These are data for the association between ultra-processed food intake and cancer and cardiometabolic disease. This is following 500,000 healthy people from the EPIC cohort in the UK. What you can see is an association, a 9% greater odds, greater risk of developing cancer and cardiometabolic disease in that time point. But what I want you to look at is that not all ultra-processed foods are associated with this risk. What you can see is sauces and spreads, animal-based products, and artificially and sugar-sweetened beverages were all associated with an increased risk of an association. But lots of those other types of ultra-processed foods had absolutely no association whatsoever. So what I want you to do is always think critically when you hear data about ultra-processed foods, that it might not be all ultra-processed foods, but some of them associated with this risk. Critical point number 2 is that almost all of the data that anybody will ever present to you so far relates to observational studies. There are almost no randomized controlled trials. Here is the most famous randomized controlled trial undertaken by Dr. Kevin Hall in the NIH, formerly of the NIH in the United States. And what he did was randomize people to a feeding study, which is the highest quality of type of research study. So everybody lives in the research unit, and they live there, in this case, for 4 weeks. And they are fed 2 weeks of ultra-processed diet, followed by a similar diet with the same energy, same fat, but it's completely minimally processed. And there's obviously a randomized arm as well. And what they showed was that when people are fed ultra-processed foods, they eat more. In this case, about 500 calories per day more. That's a huge amount of extra calorie intake. They gain more weight, especially fat mass, when consuming ultra-processed foods. So I think in the context of obesity, there's definitely clinical trial evidence of an association that ultra-processed foods are less satiating than their unprocessed equivalents. They make you feel less full and you will overeat these foods. That's relevant to obesity, but how relevant is that to gut health and gut disease? And that's what I will talk about for the rest of this lecture. I will give you, in order to cover a broad range of different gastroenterological interest in the audience, I will cover gastrointestinal cancer, disorders of gut-brain interaction, particularly irritable bowel syndrome, and I will talk about inflammatory bowel disease. So firstly, gastrointestinal cancer. This is taken from a review that we published recently where we've summarized all of the observational studies of ultra-processed foods and the risk of gastrointestinal cancer. What you can see is that the cohort studies show increased risk of developing colorectal cancer and of pancreatic cancer. So two associations between those two cancers. But we must be really careful about something that in the nutrition world we call dietary collinearity. This is the fact that when we eat one food, we might be calling it an ultra-processed foods, but it might be high in lots of other things at the same time. So for example, these are data showing that people who eat more ultra-processed foods eat more fat, eat more saturated fat, eat more sugar, eat less fiber, less sodium, more sodium and less potassium. So is it because the foods are ultra-processed, or is it because they contain lots of nutrients that we already know are harmful and fewer nutrients that we know are beneficial? So is it because they are processed, or is it because they are already nutritionally imbalanced? And of course, it's really important to identify that when we're looking at observational studies. So critical point number 4, these are also data from the EPIC cohort, and this is based upon gastrointestinal cancer risk. And what you can see is an association between esophageal adenocarcinoma, a 21% increased risk in people with high intakes, a 4% increased risk of colon cancer, and a 23% increased risk of hepatocellular cancer. Those are the data there. But what you can see is when you adjust those analyses for body mass index, Mediterranean diet, alcohol, energy, fat, sodium, and for colorectal cancer for fiber and calcium, you can see that largely those associations disappear. So it may well be that some of the harmful effects of an ultra-processed intake is already understood known imbalances in nutrition. Critical point number 5 is exposure. We talk all the time about an increased risk. This is data from Nutrinet Santé in France. I really like quoting these studies on the Nutrinet Santé cohort because the dietary assessment is absolutely optimal. They take dietary recalls that are then manually entered by dietitians, and they absolutely know whether the food is ultra-processed or not, unlike many of the other observational data that we have. So we know that this probably is a good assessment. So a 23% greater hazard of developing colorectal cancer. And this is comparing quartile 1 with quartile 4, so people in the highest quarter of intake. But look at the differences in those intakes. So to have a 23% higher risk of getting colorectal cancer, your intake of ultra-processed foods has to be around 32% of dietary energy. To reduce the risk, therefore, you would have to try to reduce your ultra-processed food intake down to 8.5% of energy. That is a 4-fold reduction in ultra-processed food intake. So, I know that none of you would never prescribe a drug without talking about the dose. You should never talk about diet without talking about dose. Because we must understand that if you're recommending that people reduce their risk, how much they need to reduce their intake by, because they need to reduce it by 4-fold. That is extremely difficult to do. For the next 1 week, I want you all to monitor every single food you eat and see if you can reduce your ultra-processed food intake fourfold. I bet there's not one single person, including myself, in this audience who could do that. I'm now moving on to disorders of gut-brain interaction. Here are cross-sectional data, again summarized in our paper here, where we show an increase in risk of irritable bowel syndrome and functional dyspepsia. These are cross-sectional case control studies, so a slightly weaker form of evidence, but more recently, these are data from the UK Biobank, which is a cohort study, so it follows people up over a longer period of time. And what you can see is for every 10% increment in UPF, so again, I'm trying to talk about the dose of UPF, so for every 10% increase in UPF consumption, there was an 8% increase in odds of developing irritable bowel syndrome. And what about inflammatory bowel disease? I know many people will also be interested in this. There was a cohort study published in the British Medical Journal back in 2021 now, and this was based upon the PURE cohort across 21 different countries across the world. And that showed an association between ultra-processed food intake, more than 5 servings per day, compared to 1 serving per day, so a 5-fold difference. It showed an association between ultra-processed food intake and Crohn's disease. Interestingly, it did not show an association for ulcerative colitis. These have now been repeated and confirmed in another 3 different cohort studies. These are data from the US Nurses Health cohort, the EPIC cohort, and more data from the UK Biobank. Another cohort study is the only one from the Nutrinet Santé not to have demonstrated any association at all. All of them show an association with Crohn's disease, but not ulcerative colitis. In fact, Neeraj Narula has now done a systematic review and meta-analyses of this data, showing a 71% higher risk of developing Crohn's disease, but again, no increased risk of ulcerative colitis. I think mechanisms are really important, and as scientists, we all must consider how this association must occur, because the only randomized controlled trial I've shown you relates to increasing your energy intake. I do not think increasing your energy intake has a major impact on your risk of gastrointestinal cancer, irritable bowel syndrome, or of Crohn's disease. So I think there must be something in this context which also is associated with risk. Here's a really great review if you want to take a look at the mechanisms. Have a look at that. But I think in the context of some of these disorders, food additives are likely to be involved. Here's a summary slide of the mechanisms of the effect of food additives on the enterocytes in the gut. So what you can see at the top is the lumen of the gut, the mucus layer, and the epithelial cells, and the lamina propria underneath. And what you can see on the left is a really nice, healthy gut with a diverse microbiome, a really thick mucus layer, and a really healthy enterocyte with really tight junctions causing an impermeable gut there. But then what you can see is consistent evidence that emulsifiers modify the microbiome, reduce the thickness of the mucus, and cause an immune cascade that results in an increase in permeability in the gut. That's also shown for artificial sweeteners, food colours, and nanoparticles as well. If you're interested in this, go take a look at that paper. In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to focus on 3 food additives. I'm going to talk about artificial sweeteners, microparticles and nanoparticles, and emulsifiers. And I'm going to first start by artificial sweeteners. So these are the things that are added to diet beverages and things like that to make them taste really, really sweet. My experience of my time in Mexico, there's a lot of artificial sweeteners in almost everything in the food supply. So I think that exposure is really high. Here is data from the UK Biobank, and it shows that there's no association between artificial sweetener exposure and the risk of Crohn's disease. So artificially sweetened drinks did not increase the risk of people getting inflammatory bowel disease. But we know there's an impact on the microbiome. So in healthy people, this is the first ever study showing this by Jotham Suez, part of Erin Siegel's and Erin Elvan's group, taking healthy volunteers and giving them saccharin, a particular type of artificial sweetener. What you can see on the left is a figure showing it's a principal components analysis talking about the composition of the microbiome, and on the right there are different taxa that were altered by artificial sweetener exposure. That experiment has been conducted by another 7 different groups, and all show the same effect: alterations in diversity and alterations in specific taxa. So we think that artificial sweeteners modify the microbiome. What about microparticles and nanoparticles? This is titanium dioxide. So when you eat a piece of chewing gum and it's bright white, or when you brush your teeth and the toothpaste is bright white, it contains titanium dioxide. The European Food Safety Agency has banned the use of titanium dioxide. The UK, the United States, and I checked this morning, Mexico still allow the use of this food additive in the food supply. So you are currently consuming titanium dioxide. This is my colleague, Professor Miranda Loma, and what she did was an experiment where she took 83 people with active Crohn's disease, and she randomized them to normal levels of this microparticle and low levels of this microparticle. She did it through sham dietary advice, which is very, very difficult to do, and is a very, very highly controlled dietary intervention trial. At the end of that study, which took 3.5 years of her life, she showed no difference in the number of people going into remission, or no differences in Crohn's disease activity index. So actually, although there are associations with this particular food additive and health, there is no impact on removing it in people with Crohn's disease. An area I'm really interested in is food additive emulsifiers. This is my colleague, Dr. Selina Cox, and we wrote this paper when we started getting excited about food additive emulsifiers. I learned one lecture on food additives when I was at university, and I knew nothing about it. So we wrote this paper here so that we could all learn a little bit more about these food additives, because we knew that the clinical community and the nutrition community actually knew very little about these things. Emulsifiers allow the immiscible formation of a liquid between an aqueous and non-aqueous solution. So anything that has fat and water in it is likely to have an emulsifier added to it. So think of mayonnaise or anything like that. Here are 3 common emulsifiers: carboxymethylcellulose, polysorbate 80, and carrageenan. Here's data to demonstrate what I showed you earlier on the figure about some of the harmful effects of emulsifiers on the gut. This is data from Benoit Chasseng's group, and what he did is he took wild-type mice, but also IL-10 knockout mice, a model of Crohn's disease, and showed that when you fed them either carboxymethylcellulose, CMC, or polysorbate 80, P80, there was an alteration in microbiome. There was also a reduction in the thickness of the mucus, so the green layer is smaller, as you can see there. There's an increase in gut permeability, and there's also an increased incidence of colitis. These are the original data upon which we got really excited about this. Based upon this, we designed this experiment. This is the ADAPT trial, and I was very privileged to be able to work alongside some world-leading scientists in gastroenterology, in microbiology, and lots of amazing dietitians to undertake the first ever randomized control trial of emulsifier restriction in inflammatory bowel disease. What we did is we took 154 people with active Crohn's disease. They had to have a raised fecal calprotectin, and we randomized them to have an emulsifier-containing diet or a low emulsifier diet, and 8 weeks later, we followed them up and took stool samples and measured that for fecal calprotectin, and we measured their clinical endpoints as well. Here's how we implemented the diet. I am obsessed by good trial design in dietary interventions. It's very difficult to do, because how do you blind people from what they are eating? And also, because of dietary collinearity, when you change emulsifier intake, you change the intake of lots of other things. So how do I know that any effect that would occur would be because of the emulsifier restriction or because of something else? So we did something which is a gold standard resupplementation trial. Both groups restrict emulsifiers. So you randomise them to 2 groups, and both are given the same dietary advice. And then you add back into the diet through giving foods and snacks. In the intervention group, you give them ones that are emulsifier-free, and in the control group, you give them ones that are spiked with emulsifiers. So they do not know which group they're in, and they are both otherwise making the same changes to their diet. So for example, we fed some groups these food products on the left, and other groups these same food products, but that had different things in them. And can you tell which contain emulsifiers or not? No, of course you can't. Can you still tell which contain emulsifiers now? So people were completely blinded as to whether they were having emulsifiers in their diet or not. We had to do this for 154 people for 8 weeks long. And then we spiked them with these snacks. We gave them 3 snacks per day, and in the control group, they were spiked with emulsifiers at standard UK doses. Here is the primary outcome in 154 patients that we randomized. Our primary outcome was a CDAI response, a reduction in Crohn's disease activity index. And what you can see is that about 50% of people responded to the low emulsifier diet, compared to only 30% in the control group. And that was significant in the intention to treat population and in the adjusted population. We also showed statistically significant differences in the numbers entering remission and the numbers having a fecal calprotectin response. So we believe there's an association between emulsifier exposure and treatment of Crohn's disease. So in the last 30 seconds that I have left, here's my summary slide. I'm not going to read that out for you. You can take photos of that. But what I want to say to you is that if you want to learn more about this, go take a look at this review paper, which covers lots of the things that we've talked about today. And thank you everybody for listening, and I'm excited to answer any questions that you may have.